This week's module will look at the issue of authority and challenges to it in cultural contexts. Just as the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War undermined the authority of the church in politics, they also signaled a new period of intellectual inquiry that further eroded the power of authorities in Western society. The scientific revolution of the 17th century and the Enlightenment of the 18th century introduced new concepts of understanding the world and the need for change. The scientific revolution is not a singular event, but rather the name given to a series of scientific discoveries in the 17th century that created new forms of knowledge and new approaches to seeing the world. The term revolution here suggests an event, but the scientific revolution occurred over the span of 2 centuries and happened in fits and starts. What the scientific revolution constituted was the development of new ways of thinking about knowledge and the taxonomy of knowledge. These new ways challenged existing institutions, for example, as universities and the church, and their influence in the production of knowledge. Moreover, the scientific revolution created new forms of knowledge, particularly new fields of science. With the scientific revolution, we see the development of a concept of science as a particular form of knowledge distinct from other forms. Scientific knowledge was understood as different from previous forms of knowledge, and still today is seen as a more valid form of knowledge. Prior to the scientific revolution, thinkers were often influenced by older thinkers, the ancient Greeks, for example, and science was similar to other types of thinking, what we might call philosophy or theology. Another important development of the scientific revolution was the desire to apply the methods and discoveries of science to all spheres of thinking. Thinkers saw science as a solution to problems, especially as scientific inquiry was newly focused on the question of how things worked, rather than why things were as they were, with the latter question being left to philosophy. The application of science was also driven by the development of the scientific method. Sir Francis Bacon's methodology, the 5 steps, including question, hypothesis, prediction, testing, and analysis, created a new form of reasoning that transformed knowledge. Bacon's method established a system of study that not only produced results based on observation, but also established a reproducible system of study. Now, experiments could be replicated and therefore verified. The ability to produce results led to verifiable data, which distinguished scientific knowledge from other types that had come before. In terms of historical situations, the beginning of the scientific revolution can be traced to discoveries in the realm of astronomy. The church was still a powerful force in terms of knowledge, including its influence on institution and on patronage networks that were invaluable to these thinkers. One such thinker was Nikolai Copernicus, who published his On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres in 1543. Copernicus examined Ptolemy's theories of space with the blessing of the church, but when he postulated a new understanding of the universe, one in which the sun was the center of the universe rather than the earth, he encountered problems. Copernicus's publication caused controversy, and he recanted his theory, but the findings were nevertheless influential on other thinkers who came after, such as Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei. Galileo was a professor at the University of Pisa, an institution that operated under the blessing of the Catholic Church. Galileo himself was a pious Catholic who worked on Copernicus's work, again with the blessing of the Church. His examination of Copernicus's observations, a replication of his experiments based on the scientific method, resulted in the publication of A Dialogue on Two Chief World Systems, with Galileo stating that the evidence revealed the validity of Copernicus's heliocentric model. Galileo based his conclusions on his own observations of the moons of Jupiter, which did not revolve around the Earth. Galileo immediately drew the ire of the Church, which hoped he would end the controversy of Copernicus's findings. Although many in the Church knew that the geocentric model was not correct, the issue was control of knowledge and who had the authority to debate knowledge. Galileo's publication led to his house arrest, and Galileo recanted his findings, although later he would recant on his deathbed. Like Copernicus, Galileo influenced others through the publication of his work. Other thinkers, the term scientist was not in use in this period, include René Descartes in France and Isaac Newton in England. Newton, whose optics was one of this week's readings. Descartes built upon the ideas of dualism and famously noted the importance of consciousness in determining subjectivity. His famous, quote, "I think, therefore I am." Newton was a mathematician and is often seen as emblematic of the new conception of scientist. However, it's important to remember that the scientific revolution was not as strong a break from the past as one might imagine, and Newton was also interested in alchemy and transmutation, ancient ideas that have since become superstition. One of the major reasons for the greater impact of the scientific revolution was the financial support of the major states of Europe. Scientific discoveries brought prestige to kingdoms, and the kings of Europe associated themselves with thinkers, foreshadowing a similar occurrence with the Enlightenment in the next century. In France and Britain, for example, the crown created scientific societies as privileged orders and fashioned themselves as scientists. The main reason for the fascination with science was the discoveries in weaponry, ballistics and munitions, and in public health, both of which improved the military capabilities of states. Thus, scientific support was often limited to these areas, but support did help improve the position of thinkers in these societies. Reflecting on the impact of the scientific revolution, again we should remember that one central component was the shift away from inquiries concerning why, which was left to philosophers, to questions of how, understanding the mechanics of things. This subtle change differentiated philosophical knowledge from scientific knowledge. However, within the larger societies, scientific knowledge had a minor impact, and instead, many pseudosciences proliferated. One of the major issues during the scientific revolution was the perceived conflict between science and religion, despite the fact that many scientists, for example Galileo and Newton, as illustrated in this week's readings, tried to reconcile the two ideas. Many thinkers suggested that science was not incompatible with religion, and instead offered new insights into it. Scientific thought also led to new understandings of religion, such as deism, a form of theology that posited God as a great scientist, albeit an absent one since he created the perfect machine in the universe. Other Christian prophets, such as Moses, were understood as early scientists. Nevertheless, scientific discoveries challenged the prevailing Christian interpretations of history. For example, the age of the Earth. Geologic time suggested by the early 18th century that the Earth was at least 10,000 years old, running counter to the short span suggested by the Church. The conflict between the two would continue, but scientists during the 17th century attempted to look at the similarities between the two. Still, other thinkers began to assert that science necessitated rethinking of religion altogether, and some offered forms of proto-atheism. For example, French thinker de la Mettrie thought of humans as machines, biological beings with no evidence of a soul. Others questioned the so-called Great Chain of Being, the idea that God created all beings in a strict hierarchy. Such ideas were cornerstones of the theory of divine right within politics, so these challenges were political in nature. The Enlightenment of the 18th century developed out of the inquiries of the scientific revolution, although Enlightenment thinkers, called philosophers, were interested in different subjects, namely political science, philosophy, and economics. The Enlightenment also signifies the increased movement of ideas around Europe, which was important to the scientific revolution as well. Think of how Copernicus's and Galileo's ideas diffused through print. With the Enlightenment, this phenomenon became more commonplace, and thinkers such as Voltaire, Smith, and Rousseau had an impact throughout the continent. Yet, each context influenced the nature of how their ideas were received and debated. In Britain, thinkers were more interested in economics, for example. In France, philosophers were more interested in politics, and in the German states, thinkers were more interested in the nature and meaning of knowledge itself. Thus, it might be more appropriate to think of this period as one of enlightenments, of several events occurring simultaneously. Enlightenment began with the publication of John Locke's two treatises on government in 1690, which was created to justify the actions of Parliament in overthrowing the Stuarts during the Glorious Revolution. Locke's work rejected the notion of divine right and instead built upon Hobbes' ideal of contract theory. However, unlike Hobbes, Locke asserts the importance of rationality as a guiding force in society. Reason was a central tenet of the philosophers in all the different iterations of the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution, with its influence on objectivity, influenced the philosophers who sought to apply its ideas to the social sciences, the study of humanity and human behavior, to attempt to uncover natural laws in the same sense as scientific discoveries had in the previous century. Because of the emphasis of rationality and reason as guiding forces, secularism was another central characteristic of the Enlightenment, as in questioning the role of religion in society. Connected to this was the rejection of absolutism as a viable political philosophy as it was practiced in Europe. Philosophers were concerned with reform and applying the ideas of the Enlightenment to improve society. Some philosophers wanted to emulate the British model of constitutionalism, to have a weakened king, while others wanted to have a strong king to implement reform. This latter group favored a form of government termed enlightened absolutism. This tendency illustrates how leaders embraced aspects of the Enlightenment as well as they had with the scientific revolution. Some examples of enlightened philosophers include Catherine, the Tsarina of Russia, and Frederick, the Kaiser of Prussia, who hoped by implementing Enlightenment ideas that their states could be reformed and become more powerful. Philosophers who embraced absolutism included Voltaire, who felt that reform could be done through the unchallenged power of a king. Two examples of the Enlightenment illustrate the difference within the realm of ideas. The first is the English Enlightenment. The philosophers of the English Enlightenment, such as Adam Smith, who is shown here, were interested primarily in economic concerns, especially mercantilism, an economic system in which the British Crown was deeply embedded within the system. Instead, Smith postulated natural laws that needed to operate freely of government intervention, so-called laissez-faire economics. This was the general tone of Smith's work, which did not critique the British Crown in the same political manner that other philosophers would, although economics are political in this case. While there were some radical philosophers in England that were concerned with reforming the system as it was, most were accepting of the system that the British had put into place. Counter to that example was the French Enlightenment, which was influenced by the events and thinkers in England during the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution and John Locke, for example. While philosophers in France were divided over supporting absolutism, Voltaire did, and Rousseau, who's shown here, did not. All wanted to reform it away from the practice as it had developed under Louis XIV. Some wanted to overturn the political structure based on notions of equality and contract and laws theory. Here, then, his ideas were quite revolutionary in nature. The encyclopedia was the central project of the Enlightenment. It was its most important activity, an attempt to systematize and record all knowledge. What was important about the encyclopedia was that all knowledge was valued and placed together without a hierarchical structure separating some knowledge, such as the liberal arts, from others, such as the mechanical arts. The contributors to the encyclopedia came from all over the continent, but the cost of the project kept it out of reach for most Europeans. The project itself was never completed, as materials quickly became dated with new discoveries. Nevertheless, the encyclopedia is an important legacy from the period, showing a way of rethinking the meaning of knowledge. Equally important in the Enlightenment was the transmission of ideas in what has come to be known as the public sphere. Publishing and literacy increased in Europe thanks to changes in education and laws. Public houses, pubs, coffee houses, and salons were important public centers where ideas could be exchanged and debated. These places offered locations where information could be spread, often by those who were literate, who read aloud while others listened and then questioned the ideas that they read to them. Salons were the quintessential notion of the public sphere. Yet salons were private spaces, where philosophers met and debated ideas. These debates were often moderated by noblewomen, who were important patrons of the philosophers. The salon was supposed to represent the ideals of the Enlightenment: rationality, free exchange, and inclusion, with the obvious exception of women. But in reality, they were full of conflict that often transcended the salon itself. Through letters exchanged after salon meetings, philosophers continued their debates. These letters, while private, were often collected and published, bringing everyone into the debate. These debates were termed a republic of letters, and this exchange symbolized what philosophers hoped to create in European society. But the Enlightenment was not limited to the writings and thoughts of the philosophers, who had little impact beyond the elites. Instead, other forms of writing were important to engaging the public. Rousseau, for example, wrote novels, and his novels had a cult following in this period. Other quote-unquote bestsellers followed, illustrating the development of a publishing industry, which has been called Grub Street by historians. This industry was aimed at serving a public rather than spreading important ideas. This publication included pornography, which had a broad readership during this period. The Enlightenment prefigured the coming revolutions in the British colonies and in France. The questioning of absolutism and the call for political reform met the reality of rulers unwilling to reform too much. The failures of reform influenced a more radical response at the end of the 18th century. Ultimately, the Enlightenment permitted thinkers to imagine a different world and to try to implement change in order to create that world.